2 weeks. That's how long she'd worked there. And somehow, that was all it took for every single face in that kitchen to turn and land on her. 10 minutes ago, this room was full, laughing, clinking glasses, the whole neighborhood. Now, just cold plates and an open door. Nobody stayed to finish. Fern, you know I didn't do this. But Fern didn't answer. She just slid the paper into the folder. And with that, she picked a side. Not Nora's. It was you. She was so sure, so ready to blame someone. And the second the words left her mouth, she watched his face fall and knew she'd gotten it wrong. Junie had barely said a word all night. Then she held out the phone, hand shaking. There's something on here. You need to see. The pen was almost on the paper. One signature and it was over. Then Nora leaned in. Wait, that order wasn't ours. And everything stopped. 2 weeks. That's how long she'd worked there. 14 days of carrying plates and learning names. And now every single person in that kitchen was staring at her like she'd ruined everything. The inspector held the folder open. Nobody said a word. Nora just stood there, the red of her hoodie the only warm thing left in the room. See? When something goes wrong and nobody knows you yet, you're the easiest one to blame. Rewind a couple of hours and this room was alive. Packed. Laughter, clinking glasses, the whole neighborhood squeezed in for one last dinner. Then something shifted. One table went quiet, then another. And before anyone understood what was happening, they were grabbing coats and leaving their food right where it sat. Now, just cold plates and an empty room. Nora stood in the middle of it, trying to make sense of a night that fell apart in minutes. That morning, none of them saw it coming. It started the way every day started, quiet, ordinary, a delivery in the back alley. The driver dropped the crates. Nora signed for them. Easy. Just a girl doing her job on a slow morning. She didn't look twice at the boxes. Why would she? Nothing about them seemed off. And that one small thing, not looking twice, was about to cost her more than she could imagine. Nora carried the crates, and one by one, there was this one box, a little different from the rest, slightly off color. She noticed it for half a second, then forgot about it. Too much to do. Junie was hanging around the doorway, hands in her apron, not really helping. Nora had left her phone on the counter. Small thing. You wouldn't even think about it. But that phone was going to matter more than anything else that night. Marco had run that kitchen for 40 years. 40. And tonight was the last night. So that morning, he started taking down the old photos. His parents, the opening day, all those faces. One by one. Nora helped him hold the frames. She barely knew him, but you could feel it. This wasn't just a restaurant closing. It was a whole life being folded up and put in a box. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. Fern had a plan. The old place was closing, sure, but she wasn't done. She wanted to open a small spot around the corner and keep Marco's name alive. Something little. Something theirs. And here's the thing. The whole plan depended on one word. Clean. A clean record. 40 years without a single mark. That's what the license transfer needed. As long as tonight went smoothly, the new place was as good as hers. As long as nothing went wrong. Then Brant stopped by. He ran a place nearby, and honestly, he seemed nice. Warm, even. Whatever happens tonight, he told Fern, that little place still deserves a chance. Sounded like a friend. He'd helped her before, too. Set up supplier accounts, walked her through the license paperwork. Real helpful guy. That's what everyone thought. Nobody in that room had any reason to look at him twice. And that, right there, was exactly how he wanted it. Later, Nora was straightening the cold storage. Routine stuff. And there was this one crate, sitting a little out of place on a low shelf. She glanced at it. Something felt slightly off. She couldn't say what. But the dinner rush was coming, and she had 100 things to do. So she let it go. Moved on. She'd remember that crate later. She'd remember it a lot. Just not in the way she wanted to. Before the doors opened, Nora and Junie set the tables together. Lit the candles, folded the napkins, joked around a little. Junie was the one person there who actually felt like a friend. The two youngest in the building, sticking together. It was a good moment. Warm. Easy. Remember this one, because in a few hours, Junie's going to have a choice to make. And the first time around, she's going to make the wrong one. Then the doors opened, and they came. All of them. Regulars from years back, families, old friends, everyone wanted one last night at Marco's table. When he stepped out of the kitchen, the whole room stood up and clapped. 40 years, right there in one sound. Marco just nodded, a little embarrassed, eyes shining. Nora watched from the side, smiling. For one perfect moment, everything was exactly the way it should be. It wouldn't last the hour. For a while, it was beautiful. The kitchen was roaring, pans going, orders flying, Marco calling out dishes like he'd done 10,000 times before. Nora was moving fast. Plates balanced up both arms, weaving between tables without spilling a drop. Junie right behind her. You could feel the joy in the room. This wasn't a sad goodbye. Not yet. It was a celebration. People laughing, glasses clinking, kids running between the chairs. Marco kept sneaking looks out at the dining room, at all those familiar faces, and every time he'd smile to himself. This was his life's work, filling up one last time. Nora caught his eye once and grinned. And honestly, in that moment, she felt lucky just to be there. Just to be part of it. She had no idea the whole thing was about to turn. Then something changed. It started at one table near the window. The laughter just stopped. A couple of guests went quiet, kind of pale, pushing their plates away. Junie noticed first. She froze, pitcher in hand, staring. Nora followed her eyes and felt her stomach drop. She grabbed some water and hurried over. Everything okay here? Polite smile. But it wasn't okay. You could see it. The people at that table weren't right. Not sick exactly, just off. Uncomfortable. Wanting to leave. And at the tables nearby, heads started turning. That's how it happens, you know? One quiet table, and everyone else starts to feel it too. A ripple. Nora tried to keep her voice calm, keep things normal. But something cold was creeping up the back of her neck. This was the moment it all started to unravel. It spread fast. Table 2. Then table 3. Within minutes, half the room could feel that something was wrong. Fern came out of the back and saw it happening. Her big night, falling apart in real time. She had the phone pressed to her ear, voice climbing, trying to figure out what to do. Do you call someone? Do you say something to the room? There's no good move when your restaurant empties out in front of you. People were standing now, reaching for coats. A few left money on the table, most didn't even bother. They just wanted out. And Fern stood there in the middle of it, watching everything she'd planned slip through her fingers. The license, the new place, Marco's name, all of it suddenly hanging by a thread. And she didn't even know yet why it was happening. And then they were just leaving, all of them. The same crowd that had stood and applauded an hour ago was now pushing toward the door, not looking back. Nora stood by the entrance, holding it open on instinct, watching the whole neighborhood file out into the night. Nobody was angry exactly, just spooked, wanting to be anywhere but here. A chair tipped over and nobody stopped to pick it up. Somebody's coat got left behind on a hook, and the food, plates and plates of it, sat there going cold on every table. Nora looked back at that room, and something in her chest went tight. An hour ago, this place was the warmest spot in the city. Now it felt like everyone had fled a sinking ship. And somehow, deep down, she already sensed the blame was going to land somewhere. She just didn't know it would land on her. In the kitchen, Marco couldn't make sense of it. He went from pot to pot, lifting lids, smelling everything, tasting a little off the spoon. 40 years he'd cooked in this room. 40 years, and not once had anyone left his table feeling bad. He knew his food. He knew every recipe by heart, every shelf, every ingredient. So how? His hands were shaking now, just slightly. Not from age. From something closer to fear. Because a man's whole reputation lives in nights like this. And he could feel his slipping away, and he didn't even understand why. Behind him, the dining room sat empty and silent. All those tables he'd just filled. Nora watched him from the doorway, and her heart broke a little. He looked so lost, so small suddenly. And the worst part hadn't even walked through the door yet. Fern followed a couple of the guests to the clinic down the street, just to be sure. And here's the good news. Everyone was okay. A little shaken, a little embarrassed, but standing, talking, completely fine. Whatever had happened, it passed quickly. Nobody was in any real danger. That mattered. It mattered a lot. But it didn't fix the problem, because the story was already out. People talk, right? Word travels faster than the truth ever could. By the time Fern got back, half the neighborhood had heard that something went wrong at Marco's on his very last night. And you know how these things go. It doesn't matter what actually happened. It matters what people believe happened. Fern stood in that waiting room, watching her guests get sent home safe. And instead of relief, all she felt was dread. Because she knew what came next. When something goes wrong at a restaurant, somebody official shows up. Somebody with a clipboard and a form and a signature line. And that person doesn't care about 40 years of history. They care about what's written down. Fern pulled out her phone, and there it was. A message. The inspector was already on the way. Her stomach turned. This was really happening. It was when Odessa walked in. The whole room went still. She wasn't unkind. That's the thing people always get wrong about moments like this. She wasn't a villain. She was just doing her job. Pulling on a glove, opening her folder, taking careful notes. Calm, professional, thorough. But calm can be terrifying when your whole future is riding on it. She moved through the kitchen slowly, checking surfaces, opening coolers, reading labels. Marco stood off to the side, wringing his hands, watching a stranger inspect the kitchen he'd built his life around. Nora watched too, from the back, arms crossed tight over her red hoodie. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the click of Odessa's pen and the soft scratch of her writing. Every note she made felt like a small weight dropping onto the scale. And everyone in that room understood the stakes, even if nobody said it out loud. If Odessa found a real problem, a genuine failure in that kitchen. It wouldn't just close the place a few hours early. It would stain Marco's name. It would sink Fern's license. It would end everything. So they stood there, silent, watching her write, waiting to hear which way the night was going to break. And then she reached the storage room. In the storage room, Odessa found it. A crate sitting where it shouldn't be. The wrong box on the wrong shelf. The source of the whole mess. And now came the part that decided everything. Odessa didn't accuse anyone. She just picked up the signed delivery slip, the one with a name on it, and slid it into her folder. Then she said it, plain and quiet. If it happened after delivery, the transfer can still proceed. That's all. One sentence. But watch what it did. Because everyone in that room understood the math instantly. If the problem came in with the delivery, if it was already bad when it arrived, then the restaurant itself was at fault. Systemic. Marco's name ruined. Fern's license gone. But if it happened after the boxes were signed for and carried inside, then it was just one person's mistake, and the transfer survives. And Fern, good, decent Fern, who had a dream riding on that clean record, turned her head, slowly, toward the new girl, the one who'd signed the slip, the one who'd carried the crates in alone. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. That single look said everything. And just like that, without anyone deciding it out loud, Nora became the answer. Nora felt the walls closing in. Everyone looking at her, that slip with her name on it, the whole night suddenly resting on her shoulders. And when people get cornered like that, scared, blamed, desperate, they do something ugly. They look for someone else to point at. So Nora ran out to the alley and found the delivery driver still loading his van. Kwame. And she went right at him. "It was you," she said. "You brought the wrong box. This is on you." She was shaking, furious, so sure she was right. Because if it was his fault, then it wasn't hers. That's how the mind works when you're drowning. But look at his face. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't angry. He was just hurt. Stunned that this girl he'd handed crates to that very morning was now pointing a finger at him in the dark. And somewhere in the middle of her own shouting, Nora saw it. That look. And something inside her went cold. Because she recognized it. It was the exact same thing being done to her 20 minutes ago in that kitchen. The blaming. The easy target. And here she was, doing it to someone else. The realization hit her like a slap. She'd become the very thing that was destroying her. Kwame didn't shout back. He just looked at her for a long second, and then he said something she'd remember for a long time. "You didn't ask me what happened." Quiet, steady. You only needed someone to blame. And that was it. That was the whole thing, right there. Nora opened her mouth to argue, and nothing came out. Because he was right. Completely right. She hadn't asked a single question. She just needed a target, same as everyone else. And he'd been standing there. The anger drained right out of her. What was left was shame, plain and heavy. She looked down at the wet pavement, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. And she meant it. Not a quick, get me out of this sorry. A real one. Then she did the things she should have done from the start. She stopped talking. And she listened. "Tell me what happened," she said. "Actually tell me." And something in Kwame shifted. Because nobody had asked him that all night. Everyone had a version of the story where he was the problem. She was the first person to just ask. And that changed everything. Because it turned out Kwame had seen things that morning. Little things. Things that didn't add up. He just needed someone willing to hear them. When Nora came back inside, Junie was waiting for her. And she looked terrible, guilty, scared, like she'd been holding something in all night. She held out a phone. Nora's phone. "I had this all morning," Junie said. Her voice was small. "I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner." See, that morning, Nora had left her phone on the counter. And Junie, bored, curious, being 19, had picked it up, messed around with it, snapped a couple of random photos while Nora was hauling crates. Nothing important, just goofing off. And she'd felt too embarrassed to admit it, especially once the night went sideways. But now, watching Nora take the blame for everything, she couldn't stay quiet anymore. "There's something on here," she said. "Something you need to see." Nora's heart started pounding, because Junie wasn't just returning a phone. She was doing the hard thing. The thing that meant admitting her own little screw-up in front of everyone. A few hours ago, when Nora had begged the kitchen for help, Junie had looked away like the rest of them. This was her making up for that moment. This was her choosing a side. Finally. Nora took the phone with shaking hands, and she looked. There it was. One of Junie's silly morning photos had caught the crates, the ones Nora carried in. And when Nora zoomed in, her breath caught. Because on that odd-colored box, right under the main label, there was a corner of a second label. A different code, just peeking out from underneath. You wouldn't notice it in person. You'd have to freeze it, blow it up, really look. But there it was, frozen in a photo taken by accident. "That's not our label," Nora whispered, and Junie leaned in closer. "No, it's not." Think about what that meant. If there were two labels on that box, then somebody had covered up the real one. Somebody had relabeled it, made it look like it belonged in Marco's kitchen when it didn't. This wasn't a delivery mistake. It wasn't Kwame being careless. It wasn't Nora signing too fast. Somebody had done this on purpose. The whole night flipped upside down in Nora's head. All that blame, all that shame. And the truth had been sitting in her own phone the entire time. She just hadn't known to look. Now she did. And her hands were steady again. Because shame is heavy. But purpose? Purpose is light. She had a thread now, and she was going to pull it. Nora went straight back to Kwame. But this time, she asked. No accusations. Just, "Help me understand." And now that she was listening, he opened up. He looked at the photo, at that second code peeking out, and his face changed. "That's not a delivery code," he said. "That's a redirect tag. Somebody added that after the box left the warehouse." He pulled out his route log to show her. And here's where it got strange. According to the system, his delivery that morning was clean. Dropped, signed, done. But then he pointed at something else. Look at the times. The paperwork said the boxes were delivered and brought straight inside. But that wasn't true, because the restaurant's own backdoor camera told a different story. The crates had sat out in the alley for a stretch, long enough for someone to get to them. Before they ever came through that door, that gap, that quiet little window when the boxes were alone in the alley. That's when it happened. That's when the label got switched. Nora felt the pieces snapping together. A redirect tag, a gap in the timeline, a box that was never supposed to be in Marco's kitchen. This wasn't bad luck anymore. This was a plan. And somebody had counted on nobody ever looking this closely. They needed to be sure. A theory isn't proof, and Nora knew that whoever she brought this to would want something solid. So they went back to the alley and looked at the one thing that couldn't lie: the back door camera. It sat up high on the brick wall, quietly watching that door all day, every day. Nora pointed up at it. "That thing sees everything that comes through here," she said. Junie checked the doorway. Kwame stood back and looked up with her. And slowly the picture came together. Here's what the cameras showed. The crates came off the van early. Kwame's part was done, clean, on record. But those boxes didn't come inside right away. They sat out in the alley, alone, for a stretch, out of sight of the door, unwatched by anyone but that camera on the wall. And that was the window. That quiet gap when the boxes were just sitting there in the dark. Long enough for someone to walk up, peel back a label, and slip a different box into the order. Then disappear before they ever stepped through that door. Not a guess. The wall had been watching the whole time. They just had to go back and ask it. They brought it all to the table: the photo, the codes, the camera gap. Nora laid it out for Fern and Odessa, piece by piece. And Odessa, to her credit, listened. But she wasn't sold. Not yet. She'd seen people spin stories before to save themselves, and a corner of a label in a blurry phone photo wasn't a signed confession. "This is thin," she said carefully. "You're asking me to hold a report over a photo." Fair enough. And that's when Marco spoke up. He'd been quiet all night, too proud, too heartbroken, choosing silence over a fight he didn't think he could win. But not now. He stepped forward, and he said the thing only 40 years could teach a person. "That crate," he said, "has never been in my kitchen, not once. I know every shelf in this place. I know every box that comes through that door. I could tell you what's on any of them with my eyes closed. And that one? That one is a stranger. Simple. Certain. The word of a man who'd earned every gray hair in that room." And Odessa paused. Because now it wasn't just a scared girl with a phone. It was the photo, the codes, the gap, and the sworn word of a man who'd never once been wrong about his own kitchen. It came down to a small office and a signature line. Odessa sat at the desk with a report in front of her, pen in hand. Once she signed it, that was it. Official, permanent, done. And even with everything Nora had shown her, she still had a job to do. A form to complete, a box to check. So she lowered the pen toward the paper. And Nora leaned in. "Wait," she said. "Before you sign, just run that code. The one from under the label, please. Just run it." Odessa looked at her for a long moment. She didn't have to. She could have just signed and walked away, let it be somebody else's problem. But something in this girl's face, that steadiness, that certainty, made her pause. She set the pen down, and she typed the redirect code into the system. Now, here's the thing about a code like that. It's not just a number. It's a trail. Every relabel request, every reroute, it all gets logged somewhere, tied to whoever asked for it. And when that record came up on the screen, the whole room went quiet, because the change hadn't come from Marco's kitchen. It hadn't come from the delivery company. It hadn't come from Kwame or Nora or anyone in that building. The request to relabel that box had come through a business account, one that Odessa recognized, one with a name attached that nobody in that room expected. Nora stared at the screen, and it all clicked into place. The friendly visit, the helpful favors, the offer to run the little place if tonight went badly. all of it. Odessa slowly picked the pen back up, but she wasn't going to sign that report anymore. Not the way it was written. Brandt was still there, hanging around the edges, playing the concerned neighbor. So they went to him. And when Odessa laid it out, the redirect request, the account it came from, his account, he didn't crumble. Not right away. Men like him rarely do. He just smiled a little and shrugged. My account handles dozens of orders a day, he said, smooth as anything. Suppliers, reroutes, relabels, that's normal business. A code on a screen proves nothing. Anyone could have entered it. And you know what? For a second, it almost worked. Because he wasn't wrong that businesses process a lot of orders. He was counting on that. Counting on the doubt. Counting on being the respected owner up against a nervous 20-year-old in a hoodie. But Odessa had done this a long time. And she didn't just have a code. She had the details. She held up the record and read it out, flat and precise. The exact time the relabel request went in. Early that morning, right in the window when those crates sat alone in the alley. The specific order number and the box code. The same box code from the crate that never belonged in Marco's kitchen. The same one peeking out from under the label in Junie's photo. 3 things, all lining up, all pointing at one account, at one moment, at one person. And slowly, the smooth look on Brandt's face started to slip. Because a code alone? Sure, that's deniable. But a code, plus the exact time, plus the exact order, plus the exact box. That's not a coincidence. That's a fingerprint. He opened his mouth to say something else. And then he closed it. Because there was nothing left to say. Everyone in that hallway was looking at him now. And they all understood. The next morning, everything looked different. Odessa filed a corrected report. Nora's name, the name that had been sitting there alone on that slip, ready to take the fall for the whole night, was taken off it completely. Cleared. And in its place, a separate investigation was opened into how that box got relabeled and who did it. The right questions, finally pointed in the right direction. Marco's record stayed clean. 40 years, untouched, exactly as it should be. And Fern's license transfer? Safe. The little place around the corner was still possible. Everything that had almost been destroyed in a single night was quietly put back together. But here's the part that mattered most to Nora. Fern came to her, and she didn't make excuses. She just said it, plain. I'm sorry. When it counted, I looked away from you. I chose the paperwork over a person, and you didn't deserve that. Nora didn't answer right away, because it had hurt. Standing in that kitchen, begging for help, watching the people around her go quiet and drop their eyes. That leaves a mark. You don't just shake it off. So she let the silence sit for a second. Long enough, to be honest. And then she nodded. Not a big, warm, all is forgiven nod. Just a real one. An understanding. People get scared. People protect what they've built. It doesn't make it okay, but it makes it human. And Nora, of all people, understood exactly how it felt to point at the wrong person when you were afraid. She'd done it herself, out in that alley, just hours before. So who was she to hold it forever? She'd learned the same lesson everyone else was learning now. The easy target is almost never the right one. Then Marco spoke up. And you have to understand who this man was to really feel this moment. Marco had stayed quiet almost the entire night. Not because he didn't care, because he cared too much and he was scared. 40 years he'd built that place, one plate at a time. And when the whole thing started crumbling around him, Some part of him just folded. He figured fighting would only make it worse. That people had already made up their minds. That an old cook arguing with an inspector would look guilty, not innocent. So he chose silence. He stood in the corner of his own kitchen and let it happen. And that's a hard thing to admit about yourself. That when it mattered most, you went quiet. But not anymore. He walked across the room, slow and steady, and he didn't look at Fern. Didn't look at the paperwork or the inspector or any of the mess of the last 2 days. He looked right at Nora, and he said 2 words. She stays. That's it. Just, she stays. Fern started to respond. Something practical about the new place, about how staffing would work, about schedules. And Marco gently raised one hand and said it again, quieter this time, but somehow firmer. Wherever this goes next, she stays. Now think about where Nora had started. 2 weeks earlier, she'd walked into that building as nobody. A temporary hire, a name people hadn't bothered to learn yet. And when things went wrong, that's exactly what made her the target. She was new, she was unknown, she was easy. The whole night had proven it. One signature away from carrying the blame for something she didn't do. But she was also something else. She was the one who refused to let a good man go down for a lie. The one who stood in a dark alley, realized she'd become the very thing hurting her, and owned it. The one who kept pulling the thread when disappearing would have been so much easier. And Marco, a man who'd spent 4 decades reading people across a kitchen counter, who could tell you someone's whole character by how they treated a busboy. He saw all of it, every piece. And he was not about to let her walk out that door as a stranger. Nora just stood there. And for the first time all night, her eyes filled up. Not from fear this time, not from shame. From something quieter and bigger than both. From being seen. From belonging somewhere she'd assumed she was only passing through. 2 words, from an old cook who'd nearly lost everything, and still had room to hand someone a place at the table. She stays. And just like that, she wasn't the new girl anymore. She was one of them. A few weeks later, the little place around the corner opened up. It was small. Really small. Fewer tables, low ceilings, a kitchen you could cross in 4 steps. And somehow that was the whole charm of it. You walked in and your shoulders just dropped. The photos made it. That wall of old frames, Marco's parents, the opening day from way back, a blurry shot of some birthday nobody could name anymore. Same crooked hanging as before. They just moved down the block, that's all. Marco was at the stove in a clean apron, stirring something, humming. Bad singing voice. He didn't care. This was the only thing he'd ever wanted, if you really got down to it. Not a big name, not a full parking lot. Just a warm room and people leaving full. He had that back now. Fern worked the door, kept touching the license on the wall like she couldn't quite believe her name was on it. She'd nearly lost the whole thing in one night, and here it was. Nora and Junie ran the tables. Same as that first night. Junie still talked too much. Nora still let her. Whatever had cracked between them under all that pressure, it had healed clean once the truth came out. You'd never know it happened. And then the door opened and Kwame walked in with the first delivery. A crate on his shoulder, grinning like he owned the place. This was the guy Nora had backed into a corner in a dark alley and called a liar. Now he was hauling in vegetables and stealing a breadstick off the counter on his way past. Marco swatted his hand. Kwame took 2. Look at who ended up in that room. The new girl nobody trusted. The old man they were ready to write off. The driver everyone pointed at first. The exact people the whole night had tried to throw away. Standing there together, laughing, setting up a restaurant. Nora noticed it, watching from behind the counter. She didn't make a speech about it in her head or anything. She just noticed how close it had all come to going the other way. How one signature would have ended it. How the difference was somebody stopping to actually look instead of grabbing the nearest person to blame. Then Junie yelled that table 4 needed water and the moment was gone. Back to work. 2 weeks ago, Nora had been a stranger here, passing through. Now Marco was yelling her name across the kitchen like she'd always been part of it. That's a good place to end up.